Wu Zetian was born in the year 6024 CE during the height of the Tang dynasty. She came from a relatively well-off family, and unlike many young girls of her time, she was given the chance to learn how to read and write. Her father believed in the value of education, and so she was introduced to books, poetry, and the classics of Confucian and Buddhist thought. This early foundation made her more knowledgeable than most women of her era, though, at the time, nobody would have predicted that she would one day rule all of China. When she reached the age of 14, Wu Zetian entered the imperial court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. She was one of many concubines, and her rank was not particularly high. Her role was mainly to serve and remain within the routines of palace life, which were structured and repetitive. The palace itself was vast, filled with long corridors, courtyards, and ritual spaces. Days were carefully ordered, filled with ceremonies, meals, and obligations. Wu Zetian learned to navigate this world, though for many years she remained in the background. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, palace traditions dictated that the emperor's concubines, who had not borne him sons, were to retire to a convent, becoming Buddhist nuns. Wu Zetian was among them. Her life in the convent was quiet, marked by prayers, chants, and the rhythm of monastic discipline. Yet history would not leave her there for long. In time, she returned to the palace, now under the rule of Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son. Gaozong noticed her, and gradually she became one of his favored companions. Unlike many in the palace, Wu Zetian paid close attention to matters of governance. She listened, observed, and learned. She developed the ability to speak persuasively and to offer advice that Gaozong found useful. Her intelligence and composure allowed her to rise above rivals in the court. As years passed, her influence grew stronger. She was no longer only a consort, she became an indispensable partner in the emperor's decision-making. When Gaozong's health began to decline, he relied heavily on Wu Zetian. She attended to state affairs, received reports, and ensured that policies were carried out smoothly. Step by step, she became the true power behind the throne. After Gaozong's death, Wu Zetian carefully positioned herself to remain in control. Though her sons were formally placed on the throne, she ensured that real authority remained in her hands. She managed court officials, eliminated threats, and tightened her hold over the empire. Eventually, in the year 690 CE, she proclaimed herself Emperor of China, founding the Zhou dynasty. This was unprecedented. China had known empresses and regents, but never before had a woman taken the full title of emperor. Wu Zetian was now the sovereign in her own right. She took on all the duties and symbols of power, sitting on the dragon throne and overseeing the vast empire. Her rule was marked by careful attention to administration. She emphasized the recruitment of officials through examinations, opening the path to government service for men of talent, even if they came from families of modest background. This helped refresh the bureaucracy with capable individuals, reducing the dominance of old aristocratic families. She also promoted Buddhism, using its teachings and symbols to support her legitimacy as a ruler. Temples were built, scriptures were copied, and Buddhist monks praised her reign as divinely sanctioned. Her reign was not without criticism, both during her life and afterward. Many Confucian scholars considered a female emperor unnatural, and her political rivals often painted her as ruthless. But her governance brought stability and continuity at a time when the empire might have fractured. Wu Zetian remained on the throne until the year 705 CE. In her later years, political struggles and opposition increased. Eventually, she stepped down, and the Tang dynasty was restored. She retired from the throne and died soon after, leaving behind a legacy unlike any other in Chinese history. Her reign was long, steady, and influential, though later historians often judged her harshly. Wu Zetian's story endures as the tale of the only woman to rule as emperor in China's vast history. Wu Zetian was born in the year 624 CE, during the height of the Tang dynasty, a time when China was one of the most advanced and prosperous civilizations in the world. She entered the world not as royalty, but as the daughter of a family that was respected and well off, though not among the highest of the aristocracy. Her father, Wu Shihuo, held positions within the bureaucracy, and he believed in the value of education. Unlike many girls of her time, who were often raised primarily to marry and manage households, Wu Zetian was taught to read, to write, and to become familiar with literature and the classics. From an early age, she was surrounded by scrolls, ink, and the steady rhythm of Confucian instruction, as well as the pervasive influence of Buddhism that was spreading widely during the Tang era. This foundation gave her a level of intellectual preparation that would later set her apart, though at the time it would have seemed unusual, even unnecessary, for a young girl. The Tang dynasty itself was a vast empire with its capital at Chang'an, a city that was the largest in the world, with marketplaces filled with goods from as far away as Persia and India, and streets where merchants, officials, monks, and travelers passed each other in the bustle of daily life. Wu Zetian's childhood would have been lived in a world of order and hierarchy, where one's place was largely determined at birth, and yet her upbringing quietly provided her with tools that would one day allow her to rise far beyond the expectations placed upon her. When she reached the age of 14, her life changed in a way that was both extraordinary and entirely shaped by the customs of her time. She was chosen to enter the imperial court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, a powerful and commanding figure who ruled a vast territory. For Wu Zetian, this meant leaving her family home and entering the carefully controlled environment of the palace. The palace was a world of its own, filled with long corridors, courtyards lined with trees and ponds, and buildings reserved for different ranks of women and officials. Life as a concubine was structured and monotonous, filled with duties, rituals, and the constant awareness of rank and favor. She was one among many young women who had been selected, and her initial position was low within the hierarchy of the court. Yet even in such circumstances, she observed, listened, and absorbed the atmosphere around her. She saw how power functioned in quiet gestures, in court ceremonies, in the emperor's decisions, and in the subtle competition among those who served him. For years, she remained in this environment, not a figure of significance in the eyes of history, but a young woman learning the rhythms of palace life and the nature of imperial rule. When Emperor Taizong died in the year 649, her life once again shifted, not through her own will, but through custom. The practice of the Tang court was that concubines without sons were to be sent to Buddhist convents to live out their days in quiet retreat. Wu Zetian was sent to such a convent where the days were governed by prayers, chanting, meditation, and the simplicity of monastic existence. The sound of wooden fish drums and the recitation of sutras replaced the ceremonial court life she had known. For a time, her life seemed destined to fade into anonymity, as many women of the court had before her. Yet history has a way of bringing certain individuals back into its center, and Wu Zetian was not to remain in obscurity. Later, she re-entered palace life during the reign of Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son. Whether by fate, persistence, or political maneuvering, she came once again into proximity with power. Gaozong noticed her, and she gradually became one of his favored companions. Unlike many others at court, Wu Zetian demonstrated not only beauty, but also intelligence, composure, and a capacity for understanding the complexities of governance. She did not remain silent or ornamental, but showed herself able to engage in conversation on matters of state. Gaozong relied on her more and more, finding her counsel steady and perceptive. As the years passed, she grew from being merely one among the emperor's consorts to becoming his most trusted partner in ruling. The path she had taken, from the daughter of a family of officials, to a concubine, to a nun, and now again to a woman at the heart of the imperial household, was already remarkable. Yet her journey was still only beginning. When Gaozong's health declined, Wu Zetian stepped into a position of extraordinary influence. She managed affairs of state, reviewed reports, and ensured that governance continued smoothly. She became indispensable, and in doing so, she established herself as more than an empress consort. She became the effective ruler of the empire in practice, even if not yet in name. Her early education, her years of observation, her ability to remain calm and deliberate, all combined to prepare her for this role. She had risen steadily through circumstances that might have ended the lives or ambitions of others, and she had done so not through force or sudden upheaval, but through patience, intelligence, and the slow accumulation of influence. By the time of Gaozong's death, Wu Zetian had already built her power carefully. She placed her sons on the throne, but she ensured that true authority remained with her. Step by step, she consolidated control until finally, in 6090 CE, she declared herself Emperor of China, the only woman in Chinese history to hold that title in her own right. From her birth in 624 to this moment, her life had been marked by transformations that few could have foreseen. She had begun as a girl in a respectable household, entered the palace as a concubine, retired briefly to a convent, and returned to rise above all rivals. The empire she now ruled was vast, stretching across plains, mountains, and rivers, filled with officials, scholars, soldiers, and peasants, all bound together under her authority. Thus, the story of Wu Zetian's early life, from her birth to her ascent as emperor, unfolds not as a tale of sudden drama, but as a steady progression. Each stage, whether her education at home, her years as a concubine, her retreat in the convent, or her return to prominence under Gaozong, prepared her for the unprecedented role she would one day assume. In a time when women were expected to remain within the household, unseen in public affairs, Wu Zetian learned, waited, and rose. The course of her life, calm and deliberate, shaped her into the woman who would eventually take her place upon the dragon throne, a place no woman before or after would occupy in the same way. At the age of 14, Wu Zetian's path shifted away from the familiar life of her family home and into the structured, ritualized world of the Tang imperial palace. This change was not uncommon for young women of her background, yet for Wu Zetian, it would mark the beginning of a long journey that would eventually set her apart from all others in Chinese history. She was chosen to serve Emperor Taizong as one of his concubines, and though this position placed her inside the most powerful household in the empire, it also bound her to a life of hierarchy, rules, and the quiet competition of the court. The palace itself was a place of immense size and complexity, with countless halls, pavilions, and gardens, each designated for specific ranks of people. For a young concubine of relatively low status, daily existence was filled with waiting, attending, and performing the small rituals expected of her. The atmosphere was ordered and ceremonial, and the pace of life was determined by the emperor's needs and the routines of the court rather than the individual will of those who lived within its walls. Life as a concubine was shaped by constant awareness of rank and position. There were many women within the palace, all seeking favor, all hoping to rise even slightly in standing. Meals, clothing, sleeping arrangements, and responsibilities were all regulated by strict codes. A concubine of lower rank would not be permitted the luxuries of higher ranked women, and every movement was observed and judged according to protocol. In such an environment, where opportunities for advancement were rare, many spent their lives in quiet obscurity. Wu Zetian, however, had been prepared by her upbringing in ways that set her apart. Her ability to read, to write, and to converse thoughtfully was unusual among women in the palace. Yet she did not make herself conspicuous. Instead, she learned to watch and listen, to understand the rhythms of life at court, and to grasp how power functioned, not only through grand declarations, but through subtle gestures, small decisions, and the quiet handling of information. Emperor Taizong was a powerful and commanding ruler, were known for consolidating the Tang dynasty's authority and expanding its influence. For a young concubine like Wu Zetian, being in his service meant not only performing her duties, but also gaining exposure to the workings of the state. Though her own role remained limited, she was close enough to observe the machinery of governance. Ministers and officials moved through the palace, presenting reports, debating policies, and carrying out the emperor's instructions. In this environment, Wu Zetian gained insights that few women of her time were able to acquire. The atmosphere of the court was both disciplined and competitive, with each person aware of their position within the hierarchy. Wu Zetian, still young, remained on the margins, but even from that position, she absorbed what she saw with care. Concubines of her standing often found themselves living in a kind of quiet anonymity, their days filled with routine duties, embroidery, music, or waiting for an opportunity to serve. For Wu Zetian, these years were not marked by sudden events or dramatic changes, but by gradual learning. The monotony of palace life gave her time to study the interactions of those around her, to notice who held influence, and to recognize how words spoken in the right moment could alter decisions. The palace was a place where appearances mattered deeply, where silence could sometimes be more effective than speech, and where favor could shift as quickly as the turning of a season. Wu Zetian endured this environment without drawing undue attention, yet she carried with her the quiet strength that would later allow her to rise. The palace itself was a world of order, removed from the common life of the empire. Within its walls, gardens were carefully tended, halls were decorated with carvings and painted screens, and ceremonies were carried out with precision. For a young concubine, these surroundings were not merely decorative. They were reminders of the structure and authority of the imperial system. Each space had its purpose, and each movement within it reinforced the emperor's central role. Wu Zetian lived within this system, bound by its expectations, yet gradually she became accustomed to its rhythm. Her days were shaped by the emperor's schedule, the changing of seasons, and the rituals of the court. Though she remained one of many concubines, she carried within her the knowledge that she had already experienced, something few women of her time had known, a chance to witness the operations of the most powerful household in China. Years passed in this environment, and Wu Zetian's position remained modest. For many, this might have been the entirety of their story. A life spent in service to the emperor, defined by duty and eventually fading into the background of history. Yet for Wu Zetian, these years were formative. They taught her patience, resilience, and the ability to move carefully within structures that were not designed to grant her authority. She came to understand that favor could be won, but also lost, and that survival within the palace depended on maintaining composure at all times. Every gesture, every word, every decision was measured. During these years, she also came into contact with Buddhism, which was increasingly influential within the Tang court. Temples received imperial patronage, monks traveled widely, and Buddhist texts were discussed among scholars and officials. Wu Zetian, already familiar with Buddhist teachings from her youth, carried with her an understanding of these ideas. They would later become a significant part of her strategy for legitimizing her rule. But even in these early years, they provided her with a framework for endurance and patience. The quiet teachings of impermanence, discipline, and meditation harmonized with the restrained life of the palace, and they gave her a perspective that would remain with her in the years ahead. Thus, at the age of 14, Wu Zetian's life entered its second stage. She was no longer a daughter of her household, but a concubine within the emperor's palace. The transition was not marked by sudden excitement or grandeur, but by the slow and steady adjustment to a world of strict order and constant observation. Her days were repetitive, her opportunities limited, and yet beneath this calm surface, she was learning and preparing. She absorbed the atmosphere of the court, the workings of government, the subtleties of influence, and the discipline of patience. Though history does not record many dramatic events from these early years, it is in their quiet monotony that Wu Zetian laid the foundation for everything that would come later. Her time as a concubine under Emperor Taizong was not a climax, but a beginning, a period of waiting, observing, and slowly shaping the skills that would one day allow her to step beyond the boundaries that confined her. After the death of Emperor Taizong in the year 649, the rules of the Tang court dictated the fate of those who had once served him as concubines. Women who had not borne children to the emperor were sent away from the palace, their ties to courtly life severed, their futures directed by custom rather than personal choice. Wu Zetian, who had entered the palace at 14 and lived there for years under the quiet routines of service, now found herself among those who were to be moved to a Buddhist convent. This practice was not uncommon. It was thought proper to ensure that women who had shared the emperor's household did not return to ordinary life, where their presence might complicate marriages, politics, or succession. Instead, they were placed in the quiet and restrained world of religious devotion, where they would pass their days in prayer, ritual, and reflection. For Wu Zetian, this meant leaving behind the vast palace with its courtyards, gates, and layered ceremonies, and entering instead the closed and orderly environment of a Buddhist convent. The contrast would have been striking. Where the palace was filled with courtiers, soldiers, ministers, and endless activity, the convent was quiet, with its stone courtyards, plain halls, and the steady rhythm of bells, drums, and chanting. Monastic life was not one of luxury, nor of personal ambition, but of discipline. Days began early, with the sounding of the wooden fish drum, calling the nuns to gather for morning recitations. Sutras were chanted in unison, incense filled the air, and the community moved together in a calm rhythm that was meant to guide thoughts away from worldly matters. For many women placed in such circumstances, this was the end of their presence in history. Their days passed in routine, measured by rituals and tasks, until their lives reached their quiet conclusion. Yet for Wu Zetian, the convent did not mark the end, but rather another stage in a longer journey. She was still young, still in her mid-20s, and her mind remained sharp and attentive, though the convent removed her from the center of political life. It also gave her time for reflection. The teachings of Buddhism, already familiar to her from childhood, would have been reinforced through daily recitation and study. She would have heard the verses of impermanence, reminding her that all worldly power and glory were fleeting. She would have listened to the chants that emphasized patience, discipline, and compassion, even as she carried within her the memory of the palace and the sense that her life had not yet reached its full course. The environment was monotonous, the days blending into one another. Yet the silence of the convent also gave her space to observe herself and the world around her. Life in the convent followed predictable patterns. Meals were simple, often consisting of rice, vegetables, and tea, eaten in silence according to custom. Work was divided among the residents, with tasks such as cleaning, tending to gardens, copying scriptures, or preparing incense. Hours were dedicated to meditation. With the body seated still, the mind encouraged to release thoughts and attachments. In such an environment, time passed slowly, with little distinction between one day and the next. The seasons changed, the leaves fell and returned, and the cycle of prayers continued without end. For many, this rhythm was comforting, a release from the uncertainties of worldly life. For Wu Zetian, it was another form of waiting, another period in which patience was required. She could not know how, or when her path would change again, but she remained attentive to possibility. The convent was not entirely disconnected from the outside world. Monks and nuns often received visitors, pilgrims, or patrons who donated offerings in exchange for prayers. Messages and news traveled along these channels, and Wu Zetian would not have been completely cut off from knowledge of what was happening beyond the monastery walls. She would have heard, slowly and in fragments, of Emperor Gaozong's rule, of shifts within the court, of the ongoing life of the empire that she had once glimpsed from within the palace itself. These pieces of information, though small, would have kept her mind connected to the world of governance and power, even as her daily life was bound to ritual and discipline. The atmosphere of the convent itself was calm, perhaps even monotonous, but it also reinforced qualities that had already taken root within her. Patience, composure, the ability to endure, and the discipline of silence all became part of her character. Just as the palace had trained her to understand hierarchy and subtlety, the convent trained her to understand endurance and inner stillness. She learned to live with repetition, to adapt to structures not of her own making, and to sustain herself in an environment where ambition was suppressed. These lessons, though quiet, were not wasted, for they deepened her resilience and prepared her for the unexpected turns her life would still take. For most women in her position, the convent was a final chapter. Once removed from the palace, their ties to politics and influence were considered severed, and their names rarely appeared again in the records of history. Wu Zetian's presence in the convent might have seemed to others like a conclusion. As well, her future reduced to quiet prayers and the anonymity of monastic life. Yet destiny, shaped by circumstance and by her own qualities, had another course prepared. Her time in the convent, though unremarkable on the surface, was not the end, but a pause, a moment of stillness before her reemergence. The years in the convent were not marked by events, but by the slow passage of time, the repetition of chants, the daily labor of tending to the simple needs of the community. Wu Zetian lived within this rhythm, day after day, with no outward sign of what lay ahead. The air was filled with incense smoke, the halls echoed with recited verses, and the walls enclosed her within the discipline of monastic order. It was a life of stillness. Yet within that stillness, she preserved her awareness, her intelligence, and her readiness. Thus, after the death of Emperor Taizong, Wu Zetian's path led her into the convent, a place where countless women before her had ended their connection to the imperial world. For her, it was not an end but an interval. The rules of the court had placed her there, but history would later draw her back, returning her once more to the palace, to Emperor Gaozong, and eventually to the throne itself. The convent years were quiet, uneventful, even monotonous. But they formed part of the long and steady course of her life, a reminder that even in periods of stillness and apparent obscurity, the future may yet unfold in ways unseen. After Emperor Taizong's death and her removal to the convent, Wu Zetian might easily have faded into quiet obscurity, but fate and circumstance drew her back into the palace. Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son and successor, took notice of her, and in time she was summoned once more into the orbit of imperial life. Her return was not immediate nor sudden, but rather a gradual reintroduction as she shifted from the silent routines of monastic existence to the layered, ritualized environment of court. The palace itself, with its vast courtyards, ceremonial halls, and long corridors filled with attendants and guards, would have felt both familiar and strange after her years in the convent. The rhythm of palace life was structured, its pace determined by ritual, politics, and the presence of the emperor. For Wu Zetian, this transition marked the beginning of her reemergence, and it would slowly place her on a path unlike any other woman of her time. At first, she re-entered in the same manner as before, as a concubine among many. Yet Gaozong's attention toward her began to distinguish her from the others. Unlike some women who focused primarily on charm or appearance, Wu Zetian brought with her the calm composure she had developed in the convent and the quiet intelligence she had carried since her youth. She had the ability to listen closely, to weigh her words carefully, and to respond with insight rather than haste. In conversations with the emperor, she demonstrated not only loyalty, but also an understanding of matters beyond the concerns of daily palace life. She paid attention to political affairs, court disputes, and the responsibilities of governance. These qualities gradually separated her from others in Gaozong's view, and her position within the palace began to strengthen. Life within the palace was a world of hierarchy and constant observation. Every action was measured, every word remembered, and every gesture noticed. Concubines competed for attention, for favor, and for influence. Wu Zetian did not compete through loud gestures or reckless ambition, but through quiet consistency. She presented herself with dignity, spoke when it mattered, and refrained from unnecessary quarrels. Over time, this approach allowed her to rise in Gaozong's esteem. He began to look to her not merely as a companion, but as someone he could trust with his concerns. In this way, her return to the palace was not just a re-entry into her former role, but the start of a deeper connection with the emperor himself. Gaozong's rule, like all reigns, was filled with challenges. Were disputes among officials, conflicts over appointments, and matters of governance that required careful judgment. Wu Zetian, by listening and advising, became an asset. She offered counsel that was considered and measured. Gaozong found in her not only comfort, but also perspective. The influence she gained was not seized suddenly, but accumulated quietly over years, built on trust and the steady recognition of her insight. Her intelligence, once fostered in her childhood education and sharpened by years of observation, now became a practical force in shaping imperial decisions. Her rise in influence was not without resistance. The palace was filled with rivals, both among other consorts and among court officials who viewed her presence with suspicion. In the Confucian tradition, the idea of a woman interfering in matters of state was frowned upon, and many would later criticize her for overstepping the boundaries expected of her role. Yet in the reality of palace life, where the emperor's health and attention often determined the balance of power, her influence could not be ignored. Gaozong came to depend on her presence, and her steady involvement in governance slowly established her as a central figure within the empire. At the same time, Wu Zetian's return to the palace was also shaped by personal decisions. She ensured that she bore children with Gaozong, which strengthened her position further. In the Tang court, the status of a woman was often tied to whether she could provide heirs, and Wu Zetian, by becoming a mother, solidified her role within the imperial household. Her children would later play a significant part in the unfolding of her authority. But even at this stage, their presence deepened her influence and secured her position. The palace itself, in this period, was a place of quiet ceremony and careful ritual. Days began with reports and audiences, where officials presented their petitions and concerns. Wu Zetian, though not formally part of these sessions, often received the emperor's thoughts afterward and helped him reflect on decisions. In this way, she became part of the machinery of governance. Even if her role was not publicly acknowledged, her advice carried weight. Her perspective shaped choices, and her ability to calm and steady Gaozong made her indispensable. Her intelligence extended beyond politics into matters of presentation and legitimacy. She understood the importance of symbols, of aligning herself with traditions and with religious thought. Already, she began to favor Buddhism as a way to strengthen her position, supporting temples, monks, and teachings that could reinforce her presence as more than a consort. By showing herself as a patron of the faith, she gained moral authority alongside political influence. This was a subtle but important strategy, one that would later grow into a defining feature of her reign as emperor. Her re-entry into the palace, then, was not marked by sudden drama, but by steady progression. From a concubine of little note, to a nun, to a favored companion of Gaozong, Wu Zetian demonstrated her ability to adapt, to wait, and to rise when opportunity presented itself. Her years of quiet observation in the palace and her time of discipline in the convent had prepared her for this moment. Now, in the heart of imperial life once again, she began the gradual climb that would eventually make her the most powerful woman in China's history. Her position grew step by step, never leaping suddenly, but always advancing. She became indispensable to Gaozong, not only as a consort, but as a trusted advisor. Her presence at his side ensured that her voice reached into the decisions that affected the empire. Though many around her doubted, resisted, or whispered against her, she endured with patience and persistence. In this way, her re-entry into palace life marked the beginning of her transformation from a figure on the margins of history to the central force in the Tang court. Thus, the quiet years of Wu Zetian's life, after Taizong's death, her retreat to the convent, and her eventual return to the palace under Gaozong, form one continuous thread. They illustrate not the drama of sudden triumph, but the slow accumulation of presence, trust, and influence. She returned to the palace not simply as she had left it, but with a new strength drawn from experience. From this foundation, her rise would continue, and the path toward becoming the only female emperor in Chinese history would unfold in steady steps, guided by patience, intelligence, and the quiet but relentless determination that marked her life. When Wu Zetian re-entered the palace during Emperor Gaozong's reign, she was at first one concubine among many, but over time she began to distinguish herself not only through beauty and charm, but also through her unusual intelligence and attentiveness. While many women of the court focused primarily on maintaining favor through appearance, clothing, or flattery, Wu Zetian possessed a quality that went beyond such surface concerns. She was observant, thoughtful, and capable of grasping the complexities of governance in a way that most in her position did not. Gaozong, who at times struggled with illness and indecision, began to notice these qualities in her, and he found in Wu Zetian not only companionship, but also someone who could help him manage the challenges of ruling an empire as vast and complex as Tang China. The court of the Tang dynasty was a place filled with layers of bureaucracy and ceremony. Officials were divided into ranks, examinations determined appointments, and rituals punctuated the days with formality. For a woman to gain influence in such a setting required more than personal appeal. It required patience, skill, and an understanding of how to navigate the hierarchy of the court. Wu Zetian gradually demonstrated all of these qualities. She was not hasty in her actions, nor did she draw unnecessary attention to herself, but instead she advanced quietly, step by step, gaining Gaozong's trust. By offering sound advice, showing a steady demeanor, and maintaining composure during disputes, she earned a place in the emperor's confidence. Over time, she became one of Gaozong's favored companions, and her position within the palace grew stronger. Unlike the fleeting favor that many concubines experienced, Wu Zetian established herself as consistent and reliable. She was able to remember details, to understand the personalities of officials, and to anticipate conflicts before they grew too large. Gaozong came to depend upon her, consulting her on decisions, both personal and political. This dependence was not built overnight, but developed through years of interaction. As Wu Zetian consistently demonstrated her ability to remain calm under pressure and deliberate in her thinking, the palace itself was a place of constant competition. Every woman who served the emperor desired to improve her rank, to gain attention, and to secure influence. The competition was not always loud or obvious, but took the form of subtle gestures, whispers, alliances, and quiet maneuvers. Wu Zetian was not free from these struggles. Yet, she approached them with patience rather than haste. Instead of rushing to defeat her rivals, she waited for opportunities, using her intelligence and composure to place herself in positions where her value to the emperor would become undeniable. In this way, she rose above others without openly confronting them, which gave her an advantage in the long run. As her influence grew, Wu Zetian bore children for Gaozong, further strengthening her position. In the imperial court, a woman's standing was deeply tied to her ability to produce heirs. By becoming the mother of imperial children, Wu Zetian secured not only her own role, but also a future claim to power through her sons. This gave her a foundation of legitimacy that went beyond personal favor, rooting her influence in the dynastic succession itself. Gaozong's reliance on her as both a consort and the mother of his children deepened the trust he placed in her, and it allowed her to participate more actively in matters of governance. As Gaozong's health began to weaken, Wu Zetian's role became even more central. Then the emperor suffered from periods of illness that limited his ability to manage state affairs directly, and during these times he increasingly relied on Wu Zetian to oversee decisions, communicate with officials, and ensure that governance did not falter. She was careful in how she handled these responsibilities, presenting herself not as someone seeking power for its own sake, but as someone serving the emperor faithfully. Yet in practice, this meant that she was gradually moving from being an advisor in private to being a central figure in the actual functioning of government. Her intelligence was matched by her sense of symbolism and legitimacy. She supported Buddhism as a way of aligning herself with spiritual authority, commissioning temples, and associating herself with the idea that her rule had divine sanction. Buddhism was a growing force within Tang China, and Wu Zetian understood how its teachings could be used not only for personal devotion, but also for political strength. By linking herself with Buddhist symbolism, she prepared the way for her future to authority that would surpass the ordinary limits of a woman's role in society. The steady rise of Wu Zetian in Gaozong's court was not without controversy. Many officials and Confucian scholars criticized her involvement in state matters, seeing it as improper for a woman to wield influence in such a way. Rivals at court attempted to undermine her, and she faced hostility from those who feared her growing power. Yet Wu Zetian endured these challenges with patience. She did not retreat when criticized, but neither did she openly defy tradition. Instead, she maintained the image of a devoted consort, all while quietly strengthening her authority behind the scenes. By the time Gaozong became increasingly ill, Wu Zetian had established herself as the emperor's most trusted partner. She was more than a favored concubine or even an empress. She was effectively a co-ruler, participating in decisions and shaping the direction of the empire. Her intelligence, composure, and patience had transformed her from a young concubine of Taizong into one of the most powerful figures in the Tang court under Gaozong. The significance of this stage of her life lies in the fact that her power was not seized suddenly or dramatically, but was built slowly, over years of consistent presence and careful maneuvering. Each step, from her return to the palace, to her role as Gaozong's favored companion, to her position as the mother of imperial heirs, to her influence during the emperor's illness, was part of a steady progression. Wu Zetian demonstrated that power could be accumulated not only through force, but through patience, intelligence, and the ability to endure. Her rise during Gaozong's reign thus marked the beginning of her transformation into the central authority of the empire. Though she did not yet hold the title of ruler in her own right, she had positioned herself so securely within the structures of power that her influence could not easily be undone. From this foundation, she would eventually step beyond the limits placed upon her and declare herself emperor. But this outcome was only possible because of the years she spent carefully building trust, demonstrating ability, and strengthening her position during Gaozong's rule. In this way, Wu Zetian's early years under Gaozong were not marked by sudden upheavals or dramatic events, but by slow, steady growth. She moved deliberately through the complexities of the palace, gaining the emperor's trust, bearing children to secure her place, and managing state affairs during times of illness. Each step was quiet, careful, and calculated, yet each step brought her closer to the unprecedented role she would one day claim. When Emperor Gaozong's health began to falter more seriously, the routines of court life shifted in subtle but steady ways, and Wu Zetian's position within that structure deepened further. The emperor was increasingly unable to manage the constant flow of memorials, decrees, disputes, and rituals that made up the daily life of the Tang government. The Tang court was enormous, and it required continuous oversight of ministers, generals, scribes, and governors spread across the vast territories of the empire. Illness often left Gaozong unable to sit for long audiences, and his energy to deliberate carefully over matters of state diminished. Into this gap stepped Wu Zetian, who had already demonstrated her reliability, patience, and keen judgment over the preceding years. Her involvement was not dramatic or announced with fanfare, but unfolded quietly, in measured steps, each small duty taken on during Gaozong's periods of weakness, laying the groundwork for larger responsibilities. Later, the emperor trusted her deeply, and it was this trust that enabled her to expand her role. Rather than appearing to seize power, she presented herself as simply helping, fulfilling duties on behalf of her ailing husband, easing his burdens, and ensuring that the machinery of government did not stall. She would read reports to him, discuss recommendations from ministers, and sometimes give her opinion when he was too tired to engage fully. At times, she even conveyed instructions directly to officials when Gaozong was confined by his condition. These tasks, which might have seemed temporary at first, gradually became a regular part of how court business was managed. Officials who wanted their petitions to reach the emperor knew they would likely pass through Wu Zetian's careful hands. Her involvement began to change the atmosphere of court politics. Ministers who had once regarded her as only a consort now found themselves needing to interact with her in more official ways. Some were uncomfortable with this adjustment, for it challenged long-standing Confucian expectations about the separation of female influence from matters of state. Others, however, recognized her growing role and sought to work with her, offering advice or seeking favor through her mediation. This gradual acceptance reflected the practical reality that without her participation, many decisions might not have been made at all during the emperor's weakest periods. Thus, even those who disapproved often found themselves relying upon her. Wu Zetian's methods were characterized by patience and a sense of balance. She rarely acted in ways that appeared rash, and she cultivated an image of calm steadiness. When disputes arose among ministers, she was often careful to listen to different sides before guiding Gaozong toward a decision, which gave her the reputation of being deliberate and even-handed. This quality helped disarm some critics, for she did not appear to be motivated purely by ambition, but by a genuine concern for stable governance. Of course, her ambition was very real, but she advanced it through a demeanor of composed responsibility rather than through dramatic confrontation. As Gaozong grew weaker, the system that developed around them became something like a joint rule. He remained the official emperor, the central symbol of authority. But Wu Zetian was increasingly the one ensuring that the government functioned day to day. The rhythm of this arrangement became familiar to the court. When Gaozong was strong enough, he took the lead in audiences and ceremonies. But when he was too ill, Wu Zetian stepped forward quietly, guiding ministers, issuing instructions, and providing continuity. Over time, it became natural for officials to expect her presence in these matters. Without formal proclamation, she had become a co-ruler in practice, if not yet in title. Her growing authority, though, was also supported by her position as mother to the imperial children. The presence of heirs gave her an undeniable legitimacy within the dynastic structure. While rivals could challenge her influence, they could not deny that her sons were central to the future of the Tang line. This combination of being the emperor's trusted partner and the mother of successors gave her a foundation of authority that few could shake. It tied her role not only to the present, but also to the future, making her indispensable both in practical governance and in dynastic continuity. The relationship between Wu Zetian and Gaozong in these years reflected a partnership that went beyond personal affection. Gaozong increasingly leaned on her for stability, and in return she ensured that the empire did not falter during his illnesses. This mutual reliance created an atmosphere in which her authority expanded naturally. Gaozong was not displaced, rather, he was supported. And in supporting him, Wu Zetian was quietly establishing herself as the central figure in imperial governance. This balance allowed her to strengthen her position without provoking immediate rebellion from traditionalists, since she appeared to be fulfilling the role of a dutiful consort, caring for her husband and empire. Yet beneath this outward image, her power was becoming more visible and more permanent. Ministers came to recognize that her approval mattered, and petitions often bore in mind her perspective, as well as the emperor's. Rituals and ceremonies continued to affirm Gaozong's supremacy, but the workings behind those ceremonies increasingly relied on Wu Zetian's hand. This dual reality, formal authority in the emperor, practical authority shared with Wu Zetian, created the unique circumstances that allowed her later to claim rule in her own right. She was laying the foundation for what would eventually be an unprecedented shift in Chinese history. The criticisms from Confucian scholars did not disappear. Many continued to murmur against her presence in governance, regarding it as improper and unnatural. But their protests were tempered by the undeniable fact that decisions were being made, and the empire continued to run smoothly. Moreover, Gaozong himself did not appear to object. He relied on her, and his reliance gave her actions the stamp of legitimacy, however unconventional. This reliance shielded her from the sharpest opposition, for few dared to openly attack the emperor's chosen partner while he still lived. As the years passed, the routines of shared governance became more entrenched. Wu Zetian read reports, consulted ministers, advised Gaozong, and at times spoke directly on his behalf. Each of these actions might have seemed small in isolation, but together they marked a profound shift in the structure of imperial authority. Step by step, she had moved from being a concubine in Taizong's court to being a trusted consort under Gaozong, and now to being, in effect, a co-ruler of the empire. The transformation was not sudden or violent, but slow, deliberate, and cumulative, marked by careful patience and unbroken composure. By the time Gaozong's health entered its final stages of decline, Wu Zetian was already the indispensable center of the Tang court. The machinery of governance had adjusted itself to her presence. Ministers had grown accustomed to her authority, and the empire itself had come to rely on her steady hand. Though she had not yet formally claimed the title of emperor, she had already crossed the threshold from consort to sovereign in all but name. The long years of quiet endurance and careful maneuvering had borne fruit, and the once unlikely prospect of a woman ruling the empire no longer seemed entirely impossible. After Emperor Gaozong's death in the year 683, the Tang dynasty entered a delicate and uncertain phase. For the throne passed to his son, yet real power did not rest in the young emperor's hands, but instead in those of Wu Zetian, the Dowager Empress. The transition was carefully managed, with rituals and formal proclamations that followed tradition. But behind these outward gestures, it was Wu Zetian who directed the affairs of state. The new emperor, Zhongzong, was formally enthroned, and officials continued their duties, as if the natural order had been preserved. Yet everyone at court understood that the young emperor lacked both the independence and the authority to rule on his own. His position was overshadowed by his mother, who had spent years assisting Gaozong and was by now deeply familiar with the complexities of administration. The court atmosphere at this time was marked by tension between appearance and reality. In name, a Zhongzong was the son of heaven, the supreme ruler ordained to govern the empire. In practice, his words and actions were closely monitored, and his decisions were subject to the approval of his mother. Wu Zetian presented her role not as an usurpation, but as a form of guardianship, a natural extension of her duties as Empress Dowager, ensuring stability while her son matured. This explanation softened the shock of her visible presence in governance, but it did not conceal the fact that she wielded authority more firmly than any dowager empress before her. The ministers of the Tang court, long accustomed to her influence during Gaozong's final years, now found themselves submitting memorials and petitions to her directly. She received these documents, read them carefully, and gave instructions on how matters should proceed. Her involvement was systematic, not hasty, and her decisions displayed the same deliberate style she had cultivated earlier. For many officials, this continuity was reassuring, for it suggested that the empire would not be thrown into chaos by the emperor's death. Wu Zetian's reputation for steadiness helped maintain order, and, in times of potential crisis, that steadiness was valued more than strict adherence to convention. Yet this arrangement also sparked unease. Confucian scholars, who upheld the traditional hierarchies of family and state, found it deeply troubling that a woman appeared to be the true power behind the throne. Their writings, though careful to avoid direct accusations of illegitimacy, hinted at disorder in the cosmic order when women assumed roles meant for men. They drew on historical examples where dynasties declined when women's influence grew too great, using these warnings as veiled criticisms of Wu Zetian's conduct. Still, their objections remained largely theoretical, for few dared to confront her openly at a time when she controlled appointments, promotions, and punishments. Within the palace itself, the dynamics of family power began to shift. Zhongzong, though emperor, found himself restricted by his mother's firm hand when he attempted to assert independence in appointments or policies. She corrected him, reminding him that his inexperience could endanger the empire. At one point, he sought to elevate his father-in-law to a position of great authority, but Wu Zetian regarded this as reckless favoritism and intervened, curbing the influence of his wife's family. This incident revealed the depth of her authority and demonstrated her unwillingness to let even her own son rule in ways she deemed inappropriate. For Zhongzong, it was a sobering reminder that the throne he occupied was not entirely his own. The court factions adjusted to these realities with varying degrees of acceptance. Some ministers aligned themselves closely with Wu Zetian, recognizing that her favor meant advancement and security. Others hesitated, torn between loyalty to traditional hierarchy and the recognition of her practical dominance. The balance of these factions shaped the climate of governance, with debates often simmering quietly beneath the surface. Wu Zetian herself was not oblivious to these tensions. She managed them by promoting those she trusted, often favoring officials of humble origins or Buddhist monks whose loyalty to her was unambiguous. By relying on such figures, she reduced her dependence on the great aristocratic families that had long dominated Tang politics. This period also revealed her skill in presenting her actions in the language of continuity and care rather than disruption. She did not proclaim herself ruler outright, for that would have risked open rebellion from conservative factions. Instead, she described her role as one of assistance, guidance, and maternal duty. Her presence in councils, her decisions on state matters, her oversight of appointments, all these were framed as temporary measures, necessary for the stability of the realm, until the emperor reached full shrill strength. Yet the longer this arrangement lasted, the more it became clear that her control was not temporary, but foundational. For the common people across the empire, these internal struggles of court politics were distant matters, and what mattered more was the continuation of order, taxes, and defense. Wu Zetian ensured that the institutions of government functioned smoothly, and the provincial administrations continued their work with little interruption. Soldiers guarded the frontiers, farmers tilled their fields, and merchants conducted trade. In this sense, her rule was accepted not because it conformed to ideology, but because it provided the stability necessary for daily life. Stability, more than anything else, legitimized her position in the eyes of those who were not directly engaged in the ideological debates of the scholar officials. The symbolic rituals of power also continued with slight adjustments. Zhongzong sat upon the throne, presided over ceremonies, and received homage, but it was Wu Zetian who guided the meaning behind these rituals. She ensured that imperial sacrifices were carried out properly, that the calendar was observed, and that the connection between heaven and the dynasty was not broken. By maintaining these outer forms, she prevented the appearance of rupture, even as the inner reality had shifted toward her authority. The empire's ideology emphasized harmony between heaven, earth, and ruler, and by keeping rituals intact, she avoided provoking unnecessary alarm. This balance between visible tradition and invisible change characterized the early years after the Gaozong's death. Wu Zetian's hand was firm, but measured, her authority clear, yet cloaked in maternal language. The court functioned with her as the unseen center, and her son remained a figurehead, a reminder of the dynasty's continuity, rather than a genuine source of decisions. Gradually, it became impossible to imagine the government without her presence. What began as the necessity of a widow guiding a youthful emperor evolved into the reality of a woman ruling in all but name. This stage of her life, poised between Empress Dowager and sovereign, reveals the slow and deliberate path by which she transformed herself into the only woman in Chinese history to take the title of emperor. It was in these quiet years, when outward appearances masked the deeper truth of her authority, that Wu Zetian's future became possible. Without open confrontation, without abrupt usurpation, she created the precedent of female control in a system that officially denied its legitimacy. By presenting her dominance as care, her guidance as duty, sleep, she built a structure that would later support her open claim to the throne. This was the foundation of her eventual reign, laid carefully in the years after Gaozong's death, as she balanced tradition and innovation with calm persistence. In the years that followed, Wu Zetian's power as regent began to solidify into something more than temporary guardianship. At first, she allowed her son Zhongzong to sit upon the throne, though she kept his decisions under strict oversight. When Zhongzong showed signs of resisting her control by trying to promote members of his wife's family to powerful positions, she acted swiftly, deposing him after only a short reign and replacing him with his younger brother, Ruizong. This action was justified on the grounds of safeguarding the dynasty from unwise influence, but in reality, it marked a decisive step toward consolidating her own authority. Ruizong was even younger and less assertive than Zhongzong, making him easier to manage, and thus Wu Zetian held direct control over the levers of state. Her position as Empress Dowager shifted into something closer to that of an unofficial sovereign, and the ministers of the Tang court increasingly recognized that their survival depended upon her favor. Her consolidation of power was not sudden, reckless. Instead, it unfolded gradually and methodically, as though she understood that the appearance of stability mattered as much as the reality of control. She surrounded herself with capable officials who owed their rise to her alone. Men of modest backgrounds who had little connection to the entrenched aristocracy. By elevating these figures, she weakened the hold of great families that might have opposed her, while ensuring that her chosen officials remained loyal. She also employed secret police to keep watch over potential rivals, a system of surveillance that instilled caution among those who might otherwise have plotted against her. Though harsh by later judgment, this system ensured that open rebellion within the court remained rare, for fear of exposure and punishment hung heavily over ambitious ministers. Religious symbolism also played a key role in her strategy. Wu Zetian turned increasingly to Buddhism, using its teachings and imagery to legitimize her rule. Buddhist monks proclaimed her as a chosen ruler, even linking her authority to prophecies that a great female sovereign would bring order to the realm. This association with Buddhist ideals offered her a spiritual framework that softened resistance to her power. Confucian scholars may have criticized the reversal of gender roles, but Buddhism provided an alternative vision that allowed people to imagine her rule as part of a cosmic plan. Temples were built, texts were circulated, and her connection to Buddhist prophecy was repeated in both the capital and the provinces. Over time, this religious endorsement began to seep into the cultural imagination, reinforcing her legitimacy beyond the confines of court politics. The rituals of government also reflected her careful balancing act. Official proclamations were issued in the name of Ruizong, yet Wu Zetian's presence was always evident. Ministers sought her approval, courtiers awaited her decisions, and no policy was enacted without her consent. She presided over councils, listened to reports, and gave instructions with the same authority that an emperor would have exercised. Yet by keeping her son formally on the throne, she avoided the charge of open usurpation, presenting her actions as a continuation of the dynasty rather than a disruption of it. This dual reality, her authority in practice, his authority in name, preserved a fragile balance between innovation and tradition. In the provinces, the effects of her governance became clearer. Wu Zetian paid careful attention to the recruitment of officials through examinations, expanding opportunities for talented men who were not from powerful families. This policy had far-reaching consequences, for it altered the composition of the bureaucracy, allowing individuals of skill rather than lineage to rise through the ranks. The new officials, grateful for their advancement, gave their loyalty to her. This meritocratic tendency weakened the grip of hereditary elites and reinforced her own power as the source of official careers. The state apparatus thus shifted subtly, reshaped by her policies into a tool that served her vision. Even in her exercise of justice, Wu Zetian maintained a balance between severity and benevolence. Harsh punishments were inflicted upon those suspected of conspiracy, sometimes extending to entire families. Yet she also took care to reward loyalty, to promote the diligent, and to ensure that grievances among the common people were addressed. Petitioners could appeal to her directly, and she cultivated an image of accessibility that suggested she was both stern and caring. By managing her public image in this way, she maintained the aura of a ruler concerned with fairness, even as her methods of control were often ruthless. The slow transformation of her role did not go unnoticed by historians and scholars of her time. Some praised her as an extraordinary figure who preserved order in a dangerous moment, while others whispered of disruption in the natural order of things. Yet within the empire itself, life continued with relative stability. Farmers sowed their crops, merchants carried their goods along the Silk Road, soldiers guarded the borders, and administrators ensured the flow of taxes. The ordinary rhythms of Tang society endured, and as long as these rhythms remained undisturbed, the identity of the true ruler mattered little to many. Her continued reliance on ritual was also significant. She ensured that the great sacrifices to heaven and earth were carried out correctly, that the imperial calendar was observed, and that the symbolism of dynasty was never abandoned. Though she gradually assumed more direct authority, she clothed her rule in the familiar garments of tradition. The outward trappings of Tang legitimacy were preserved even as the substance shifted to her hands. This careful maintenance of appearances reduced the possibility of open revolt, for the continuity of ritual reassured those who might have otherwise resisted. Over time, the fiction that Ruizong ruled became thinner, and the reality of Wu Zetian's authority grew undeniable. Ministers referred to her decisions as final, her audiences as decisive, and her commands as law. Gradually, the court began to acknowledge her as more than regent, even if the title of emperor had not yet been claimed. This gradual acceptance reveals her patience, for she did not seize power in a single bold act, but rather let her authority grow until it seemed almost natural. By the time she formally assumed the throne in her own name, much of the groundwork had already been laid, and the empire was accustomed to her rule. Thus, Wu Zetian's consolidation of power after Gaozong's death was not a sudden break with tradition, but a slow and deliberate reconfiguration of it. She deposed one son, managed another, built a loyal bureaucracy, employed surveillance, embraced Buddhist prophecy, and maintained rituals of continuity. Each step was careful, each decision part of a larger strategy to ensure that her authority could not be easily challenged. The result was a reign, though controversial in the eyes of traditional scholars, was marked by order, stability, and the steady functioning of empire. What began as guardianship matured into sovereignty, not through abrupt conquest, but through a gradual and persistent reshaping of power. When Wu Zetian finally decided to claim the throne outright, it was less a sudden leap and more the inevitable culmination of years of careful maneuvering. The empire had already been governed by her hand for so long that the transition, though momentous in name, felt natural in practice. By the year 690, the fiction of her ruling only as Empress Dowager had grown increasingly thin, and the structures of the Tang court already revolved entirely around her decisions. Her ministers consulted her before all important matters. Edicts bore her influence, and no policy could be enacted without her approval. The act of declaring herself emperor was, in many ways, a recognition of the reality that had existed for more than a decade. Yet it was still a remarkable moment in Chinese history, for never before had a woman taken the title of emperor in her own right. And for centuries thereafter, no one would do so again. The formalities of the transition were conducted with deliberate care. Wu Zetian declared the founding of a new dynasty, which she named Zhou, after the ancient Zhou dynasty of early Chinese history. This choice was no accident, for by aligning herself with the revered memory of one of China's oldest dynasties, she created a sense of continuity with the distant past. She presented her rule not as a disruption of tradition, but as a revival of ancient legitimacy, a restoration of a cosmic order that had always included the possibility of a just and capable ruler, regardless of gender. Rituals were performed, sacrifices offered, and proclamations issued that spoke of heaven's mandate passing into her hands. These ceremonies were not simply pageantry, they were the symbolic language through which legitimacy was constructed in imperial China, and Wu Zetian understood their importance deeply. Her reign as emperor was marked by the same careful combat of innovation and continuity that had characterized her regency. She did not discard the machinery of Tang government, but instead refined it, strengthening the examination system, continuing to promote men of talent from outside the hereditary aristocracy, and maintaining strict oversight over officials. Surveillance remained a central part of her governance, with secret police and informers ensuring that dissent within the court was kept in check. Those who were suspected of treachery faced severe punishments, sometimes extending to their families. Such measures cast a shadow over her court, yet they also discouraged rebellion, and thus the empire remained largely stable under her reign. Religion continued to serve as a pillar of her authority. Wu Zetian fostered the spread of Buddhism, supporting the building of temples and the dissemination of texts that emphasized her role as a divinely chosen sovereign. Buddhist monks proclaimed her as the incarnation of a bodhisattva, destined to bring order and peace. This religious endorsement provided a spiritual justification for her unprecedented position, offering ordinary people a framework to accept the rule of a female emperor. At the same time, she did not entirely abandon Confucian ritual. She ensured that ceremonies to heaven and earth were maintained, the imperial calendar observed, and the forms of dynastic legitimacy respected. By combining Buddhist prophecy with Confucian ritual, she crafted a unique blend of ideology that secured her throne from both spiritual and traditional perspectives. Her policies often demonstrated a concern for effective governance. She reduced taxes in times of hardship, distributed relief during famines, and ensured that roads and canals were maintained to facilitate the movement of grain and goods. She appointed officials who demonstrated competence, rather than simply relying on family connections, which strengthened the efficiency of the bureaucracy. While her court was marked by suspicion and surveillance, her administrative measures contributed to the general stability of the realm, and many regions experienced prosperity during her rule. Her reign, though remembered with ambivalence by later Confucian historians, was not marked by chaos or decline, but by order and relative peace. The empire she ruled was vast, stretching across much of East Asia, and its borders were contested by nomadic groups and neighboring states. Zetian maintained the defense of these frontiers with diligence, dispatching generals to secure the borders and ensuring that the military remained loyal. She did not personally lead armies, but she supervised military appointments closely, ensuring that generals who gained prominence did not grow powerful enough to challenge her rule. Through a careful balance of reward and restraint, she kept the military under her control, preventing the kind of usurpation that had toppled other dynasties in the past. Life in the capital during her reign reflected both continuity and change. The grand avenues of Chang'an remained filled with merchants, artisans, scholars, and officials. Thrived with goods from distant lands, brought along the Silk Road by caravans that connected China with Central Asia and beyond. Foreign embassies still arrived at court, paying tribute and acknowledging the authority of the emperor. Though in this case, the emperor was a woman. The rituals of court life continued, with officials bowing before the throne, memorials submitted for imperial review, and edicts announced to the provinces. What had changed was the presence of a female ruler at the center of it all, a sight unfamiliar, yet increasingly accepted by those who depended upon her decisions. Zetian's court was not without intrigue. The atmosphere of suspicion meant that accusations of treason or disloyalty were common, and ministers often lived in fear of denunciation. Some were executed, others exiled, and a few rose rapidly, only to fall just as swiftly. Yet even within this climate, she fostered capable administrators, and many reforms carried out during her reign would outlast her dynasty. The examination system, in particular, continued to grow in importance, gradually reshaping the nature of Chinese officialdom for centuries to come. Her emphasis on ability over lineage planted seeds that would bear fruit long after her reign ended. Despite the controversies surrounding her methods, the empire endured under her rule. Ordinary people continued their daily lives, farmers tended their fields, and merchants carried their wares. The bureaucracy functioned, taxes were collected, and the grand machinery of imperial China continued to turn. In this sense, her reign was not a rupture, but a continuation, demonstrating that the empire could be governed effectively, even under a ruler who defied traditional expectations of gender. The fact that stability was maintained was itself a testament to her capability. For legitimacy in imperial China was often judged not by adherence to doctrine, but by the ability to preserve order and prosperity. Her decision to declare herself emperor, then, was not merely a personal ambition, but the logical outcome of a process that had unfolded over many years. By the time she took the title, she had already ruled in all but name, and the empire had already adapted to her authority. The proclamation of a new dynasty was both symbolic and practical, a way to formalize what had already become reality. Though later historians would criticize her as a usurper and point to her harsh methods, it is undeniable that she held the empire together at a time when weaker hands might have allowed it to fracture. In the calm passage of years, her reign as emperor stretched on, not marked by spectacular conquests or dramatic upheavals, but by the steady maintenance of governance. This slow rhythm of administration, ritual, and order gave her rule a certain monotony, yet it was precisely this monotony that allowed the empire to endure. In the quiet routines of court life and the ordinary labors of farmers and merchants, the reality of her authority became simply another fact of existence, unremarkable in its persistence. Thus, Wu Zetian's declaration of herself as emperor stands as both an extraordinary moment in history and a continuation of the ordinary flow of governance that defined imperial China. In the later years of Wu Zetian's reign, the rhythms of governance settled into a kind of quiet repetition that masked both the strength and the fragility of her rule. By this time, she had already established herself firmly as emperor, and the novelty of a woman holding supreme power had in many ways diminished within the court. Ministers addressed her with the same rituals of deference they had shown to her male predecessors, and imperial proclamations bore her authority without hesitation. The machinery of administration functioned much as it always had, collecting taxes, dispatching envoys, and maintaining the records of a vast empire. Yet beneath this surface of continuity lay the growing weight of age, suspicion, and the natural erosion of political order that time inevitably brings. As she grew older, Wu Zetian began to rely more heavily on those closest to her, not only trusted ministers, but also figures from her personal household. Her confidence in her own judgment had not diminished, but the burdens of constant oversight led her to delegate authority in new ways. Among the most notable of these figures were two young favorites, brothers named Zhong Yizhi and Zhong Changzong, who became not only personal companions, but also wielders of political influence. Their presence at court was a source of resentment among many ministers who regarded them as unworthy of their prominence. Yet Wu Zetian relied upon them for companionship and loyalty in her advancing years. This reliance would later become one of the vulnerabilities of her rule, for it provided her enemies with a justification to conspire against her authority. The empire itself remained largely stable, yet signs of strain began to emerge. The bureaucracy, while still efficient, grew increasingly cautious, with officials more concerned about avoiding suspicion than pursuing bold reforms. The network of informers and secret police, which had long been a cornerstone of her control, fostered an atmosphere of fear that discouraged dissent, but also stifled open debate. Ministers often hesitated to speak frankly, fearing that even minor disagreements might be construed as treachery. This meant that while the machinery of governance continued, it did so in a more rigid and cautious manner, with fewer voices willing to question or innovate. Her age also made the question of succession more pressing. Though she had founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, it lacked the deep roots of the Tang family line, and many in the aristocracy longed for the restoration of the Tang name. Wu Zetian had sons by Emperor Gaozong, and though they had previously been sidelined in favor of her direct rule, they remained figures of potential importance. At times she considered restoring one of them as her heir, yet she hesitated, for to do so too soon might undermine her own position. The balance between preserving her personal authority and planning for continuity became increasingly delicate as the years passed. Outside the palace, the ordinary lives of her subjects carried on with the same steady rhythm. Farmers plowed their fields, collected their harvests, and paid their taxes. Merchants carried silk, tea, and ceramics across great distances, exchanging them for horses, spices, and other foreign goods. The roads remained open, the canals maintained, and the markets in the great cities continued to bustle with activity. For the majority of people, the question of who sat upon the throne mattered less than the stability of daily life, and under Wu Zetian, stability was preserved. This fact, more than anything, allowed her reign to endure as long as it did, for the empire did not collapse under the weight of her unprecedented rule. Yet within the court, opposition slowly gathered. Ministers and princes of the Tang family, though cautious, harbored the desire to see the dynasty restored. They viewed Wu Zetian's advancing age and her reliance on her young favorites as opportunities to challenge her hold on power. Conspiracies were whispered in quiet halls, letters exchanged in secrecy, and alliances formed in preparation for a time when she might falter. Still, no open rebellion occurred during her lifetime, a testament both to the fear she inspired and to the loyalty of those who benefited from her rule. In her final years, the court grew quieter, less dynamic, more a place of routine than of innovation. Wu Zetian continued to preside over audiences, to issue decrees, and to participate in the rituals that affirmed her role as emperor. But the energy of her earlier years, when she had outmaneuvered rivals and reshaped the bureaucracy, was no longer as evident. Instead, her reign took on the quality of endurance, a slow continuation of patterns already established, like the unchanging cycle of the seasons. Ministers recorded her words, messengers carried her orders, and scribes preserved the annals of her reign, all while the empire continued to move forward under the steady but aging hand of its ruler. Eventually, Her declining health gave her opponents their chance. In 705, a group of ministers and Tang princes acted decisively, orchestrating a palace coup that removed her young favorites and compelled her to step down from the throne. The Tang dynasty was restored, and Wu Zetian, who had once claimed the mandate of heaven for herself, was left with little choice but to relinquish the power she had held for decades. Though the restoration was framed as a return to order, it was in fact a recognition that her long and extraordinary reign had reached its natural end. She died not long afterward, her body placed within the great mausoleum she had prepared, her memory left to the judgment of history. The years that followed saw her reputation shaped and reshaped by historians, many of them loyal to Confucian ideals that disapproved of a woman taking the throne. They wrote of her harsh methods, her surveillance, her executions, and her reliance on favorites, painting her as a cautionary figure. Yet the record of her reign also shows stability, prosperity, and a functioning empire. Farmers harvested their crops, merchants plied their trades, and borders were defended. Her governance, while severe, was effective, and her reforms in the civil service examinations left a legacy that shaped the bureaucracy of China for centuries. In the end, her story became a blend of criticism and grudging recognition. Wu Zetian had been both ruthless and capable, feared and respected, condemned and admired. She had broken through the constraints of her society to become emperor in her own right, a feat unmatched by any other woman in Chinese history. Yet her reign also demonstrated the limits of power, for even the strongest ruler could not escape the passage of time or the ambitions of those who waited in the shadows. Thus, the closing chapter of Wu Zetian's life was marked not by dramatic upheaval, but by the slow erosion of authority, the quiet persistence of routine, and the inevitability of succession. The empire she had ruled did not collapse with her passing. Instead, it continued, shaped by her legacy yet moving beyond her, as all dynasties eventually must. Her name endured, recorded in chronicles, debated by scholars, and remembered by generations. Though later historians sought to diminish her, the simple fact of her reign remained undeniable. She had sat upon the dragon throne as emperor, and she had ruled effectively for many years. In this way, Wu Zetian's later years, though quieter and less dramatic than her rise to power, were no less significant. They revealed the endurance of her authority, the stability she maintained, and the inevitable decline that comes with age. Her reign closed not with a sudden fall, but with a gradual fading, like the slow dimming of a lamp at the end of a long night. And in that dim light, the story of her rule became part of the long, unbroken flow of Chinese history, steady, enduring, and woven into the fabric of an empire that had seen many rulers, but only one woman who called herself emperor. The legacy of Wu Zetian after her death became a subject of endless debate, reinterpretation, and quiet reflection across the centuries that followed. When she passed away in the early 8th century, she left behind an empire that had not collapsed, but had instead continued along its path of endurance and repetition. Yet, her personal story, unlike that of many emperors before her, became wrapped in questions of morality, gender, and legitimacy. Chroniclers, scholars, poets, and officials all found themselves unable to ignore her presence in history, though many sought to mold her memory into something that fit the ideals and prejudices of their own times. To later Confucian historians, she was an anomaly, a disruption of the natural order that placed men in positions of power and women in more private roles. They wrote of her with language that emphasized her cruelty, her suspicion, and her reliance on manipulative favorites, framing her as a warning against the dangers of overturning tradition. At the same time, however, her achievements could not be erased. The empire had remained stable under her rule. The bureaucracy had been refined and expanded, and the principle of merit through examinations had gained greater strength during her reign. This tension in her legacy meant that accounts of her life took on a dual quality, at once condemning and acknowledging. On the one hand, writers described her rise to power as a story of ruthless ambition, of a concubine who destroyed rivals and manipulated circumstances to ascend the throne. On the other hand, they could not deny that she had ruled effectively, held the empire together, and ensured continuity through decades of her leadership. The result was a body of historical writing that was often repetitive, dwelling on tales of intrigue and cruelty, while reluctantly admitting the accomplishments that defined her reign. For later readers, this created a picture of Wu Zetian that was both vivid and distorted, an image shaped as much by disapproval as by recognition. As centuries passed, the memory of Wu Zetian drifted through cycles of neglect and rediscovery. In times when Confucian orthodoxy was especially strong, she was depicted as a cautionary figure, her reign framed as a disruption rather than a contribution. In times when the achievements of strong rulers were valued more than adherence to tradition, her rule was viewed with greater neutrality, sometimes even with admiration. The monuments and structures associated with her, such as her grand tomb at the Qianling Mausoleum, stood quietly through these shifts in reputation, silent reminders that, regardless of opinion, she had indeed held the throne. That tomb, remarkable in its scale, remains one of the most visible symbols of her reign, housing not only her remains, but also those of Emperor Gaozong, with whom she had once shared the imperial household. The tomb itself has never been opened, leaving much about her final resting place unknown, and in that sealed silence, her presence lingers as a kind of unresolved question in Chinese history. Her legacy also came to be reflected in popular imagination, in stories, dramas, and legends that cast her in roles ranging from villain to heroine. These stories, passed down and reinterpreted, often carried a slower rhythm, retelling familiar details with slight variations, embedding her image in cultural memory. In some accounts, she appeared as a cunning manipulator who climbed over the bodies of her rivals to seize the throne. In others, she was depicted as a determined and capable ruler, someone who maintained order in a vast empire at a time when disorder might otherwise have prevailed. These dual images, one of ruthless ambition, the other of capable governance, were never fully reconciled, and in their unresolved tension lies much of her enduring fascination. For ordinary people centuries after her death, Wu Zetian's reign was often remembered in simpler terms. Farmers and merchants may not have known all the details of her rise and fall, but they knew that during her years of power, the empire had remained largely stable, with taxes collected, roads maintained, and borders defended. Her reign had not brought famine or collapse, and for many in the countryside, that was enough. Stability, more than anything else, defined the measure of a ruler in their eyes, and Wu Zetian had provided that. Thus, while official histories debated her morality, the lived memory of her reign among the people was perhaps calmer, less judgmental, and more focused on the practical outcomes of her governance. Over time, as gender roles in society were discussed and debated, Wu Zetian's story gained new meanings. For some, she represented the dangers of women stepping beyond the roles prescribed to them by tradition, a living example, in their eyes, of chaos born from disorder. For others, especially in later centuries, she became a symbol of possibility, proof that a woman could rise to the highest position and govern effectively. In this way, her image shifted with the needs of different eras, sometimes warning, sometimes inspiring, always present in the background of historical reflection. Modern scholars, with access to a broader range of records and with less strict adherence to Confucian orthodoxy, have revisited her reign with a calmer, more balanced perspective. They note the severity of her rule, the executions, and the atmosphere of surveillance that marked her court. But they also note her reforms, the ways in which she promoted capable individuals, regardless of their background, and her contributions to the bureaucratic structures that defined the later Tang dynasty. They observe that while she was ruthless, she was not reckless, and while she was ambitious, she was also pragmatic. This balanced assessment allows her to be seen not simply as an anomaly, but as a ruler in her own right, judged by the same standards as others. Her legacy, then, is not one of simple categories. She was not entirely villain nor entirely hero, not wholly condemned nor wholly praised. Instead, her memory drifts in the slow, steady current of history as a complex figure, shaped by her time, judged by later ages, and remembered in ways that say as much about those who remember as about the woman herself. Her story is, in many ways, less about the excitement of events and more about the enduring questions it raises about power, legitimacy, gender, and the writing of history itself. Thus, Wu Zetian's legacy rests not only in the structures she reformed or the stability she preserved, but also in the long, repetitive cycles of debate her life inspired. Each generation that considered her added its own layers of judgment, reshaping her image while never erasing the core fact of her reign. She remains, across the centuries, the only woman to hold the title of emperor in Chinese history, a distinction that cannot be undone by criticism or praise. Her memory persists quietly, steadily, like the passing of time itself, a reminder that history often resists simple conclusions, and that legacies, like rains, unfold slowly, shaped by the calm yet unending rhythm of remembrance. The broader significance of Wu Zetian's reign reaches beyond the details of her personal story, and even beyond the borders of the Tang dynasty, touching on the slow unfolding of Chinese history and the wider questions of governance, legitimacy, and cultural continuity. In the centuries following her rule, Chinese political thought continued to reflect on the meaning of authority, the conditions of stability, and the obligations of rulers. Wu Zetian became a part of this reflection, not only as an individual figure, but also as a symbol that could be shaped according to the needs of later debates. Her life and reign became a reference point, whether as a warning against ambition or as an example of determined governance. The story of her rise, her years of rule, and her legacy was never truly forgotten, even in eras when official histories sought to diminish her role or emphasize her faults. This persistence alone indicates the significance of her reign, for the truly insignificant rulers of history often fade into silence. While Wu Zetian's presence has never disappeared, her reign also reflected and reinforced the long-lasting nature of the imperial system itself. Despite the unusual circumstance of a woman holding the throne, the empire itself remained intact. Its bureaucratic structures continued to function, and its Confucian ideals of order and hierarchy were not undone. This resilience demonstrated the strength of the Chinese imperial state, capable of enduring not only dynastic changes, but also challenges to its traditions. Wu Zetian ruled as an emperor, not as a radical departure from the system. And in so doing, she underscored the adaptability of that system. The examinations she supported, the officials she promoted, and the structures she maintained all became part of the steady continuity that defined Chinese governance for centuries afterward. Her reign thus revealed both the flexibility and the endurance of the imperial framework, showing how it could incorporate even an unprecedented female emperor without collapsing. In cultural terms, Wu Zetian's significance extended into literature, art, and folklore. Poets and writers of later generations often returned to her story, retelling it in calm, familiar cadences that carried the same details again and again. She appeared in tales of court intrigue, in descriptions of ambition, and in reflections on power. These depictions rarely sought to excite or to glorify, but instead carried an almost meditative repetition, reinforcing her presence in the cultural imagination. Artists also represented her in various ways, sometimes as a stern figure seated upon the throne, sometimes as a symbol of feminine power, and sometimes as a character in moral tales. In each form, she was remembered, her image circulating quietly through the centuries, never quite erased, never entirely settled. Her tomb, still unopened after more than 1,000 years, stands as a physical reminder of her reign and a silent statement of her lasting significance. The Qianling Mausoleum, shared with Emperor Gaozong, is among the largest and most impressive burial sites of the Tang dynasty. Its sealed chambers preserve, perhaps, unknown records, treasures, or remains that could tell more about her life and her times. Yet it remains undisturbed, in part out of respect and in part due to the recognition that history does not always reveal itself easily. The unopened tomb allows Wu Zetian's memory to remain partly veiled, a presence felt but not fully understood. An enduring puzzle in the long story of China's past. In this sense, her significance lies not only in what is known about her, but also in what remains concealed, a combination of memory and mystery that ensures her continued place in history. Beyond China, her reign also holds meaning for the wider human story of leadership, power, and gender. The fact that she remains the only woman to hold the title of emperor in Chinese history places her in a unique position, not just nationally, but globally. In a world where most societies reserved political power for men, her rise and rule stand out as an exception. Though her reign did not transform the roles of women in general, it demonstrated the possibility of a woman exercising supreme authority, even in a highly patriarchal society. Later generations outside China have looked back on her reign with curiosity, seeing in her story both the uniqueness of her achievement and the universality of questions about power and legitimacy. Her reign also influenced the slow development of political thought concerning merit and ability, by promoting officials through examinations and by favoring those who demonstrated talent rather than merely relying on noble birth. She contributed to the strengthening of meritocratic ideals within the imperial system. While not invented by her, the civil service examination system gained momentum under her reign, and in the centuries to come, it became one of the defining features of Chinese governance. In this sense, her significance is not only symbolic, but also practical, as she played a role in shaping institutions that outlasted her and became deeply embedded in the rhythms of Chinese political life. The memory of Wu Zetian's reign also highlights the way history itself is written and preserved. Much of what is known about her comes from sources shaped by Confucian ideals, which often cast her in a negative light. Yet even within these biased accounts, her achievements remain visible. This reminds us that history is not only a record of events, but also a reflection of the values and judgments of those who record it. Wu Zetian's story thus becomes an example of how figures can be both remembered and reshaped, condemned yet acknowledged, criticized yet preserved. The fact that she has continued to be studied, debated, and retold for over a millennium underscores her enduring significance in the larger pattern of historical reflection. In the end, Wu Zetian's broader significance lies not in dramatic episodes or singular events, but in the steady, enduring presence she maintains in the memory of China and the world. She represents the complexity of power, the adaptability of political systems, the shifting roles of women, and the resilience of historical memory. Her story is not one of simple praise or condemnation, but of persistence, of a figure who remains present in history despite attempts to diminish her. Her reign, though long past, continues to ripple quietly through the centuries, a reminder of the slow, steady unfolding of time and the way individuals, once gone, can still shape the rhythms of collective memory. Her life and rule, in their broader significance, serve as an example of how history contains both the ordinary and the extraordinary, both continuity and change. Wu Zetian was unusual in her ascent to the throne, yet the empire she governed continued along its established path. demonstrating both the uniqueness of her achievement and the steadiness of the system she inhabited. Her reign illustrates the paradox of history itself, where individuals matter deeply, yet the structures of society endure beyond them. And so her significance, calm and enduring, rests not only in the details of her actions, but also in the way her story has been told, retold, and remembered across the ages, slowly, steadily, and without end. The legacy of Wu Zetian has lived on in many forms, and it has been shaped and reshaped by the people who recorded her life, told her story, and reflected on her meaning over time. The way her image has been remembered is not a fixed or final thing, but a process, unfolding slowly across centuries. In the years immediately following her reign, the official historians of the Tang dynasty treated her harshly, presenting her as ambitious, ruthless, and unnatural in her desire for power. This perspective was influenced strongly by the Confucian ideals that valued order, hierarchy, and especially male authority. For these historians, a woman holding the throne seemed to be a dangerous break in the natural order, and so they sought to frame her story as a cautionary tale. Yet even as they criticized her, they could not erase the fact that she had ruled, nor could they deny the effectiveness of her government in maintaining stability and prosperity. This tension between condemnation and acknowledgement marked the earliest stages of her legacy. In later centuries, the memory of Wu Zetian continued to develop as new generations of scholars and storytellers revisited her reign. In some accounts, she remained a figure of warning, her ambition described as excessive and her methods as harsh. But in other retellings, she began to appear as an example of strength, decisiveness, and even justice. Some poets and writers emphasized her support for Buddhism, her role in promoting talented officials, and her ability to govern a vast empire. In this way, her legacy was not fixed, but became a mirror reflecting the concerns and values of each era. When stability and order were emphasized, she was depicted as dangerous. When ambition and ability were celebrated, she was portrayed more favorably. Over time, this shifting image made her into one of the most complex figures in Chinese history. The folklore surrounding Wu Zetian also contributed to her lasting memory. Popular tales and stories often took liberties with historical accuracy, but they helped to keep her presence alive in the cultural imagination. She was sometimes described as cunning and manipulative, but also as clever and resourceful. In many ways, these stories were less about the historical figure herself and more about the themes of power, gender, and morality that her life represented. The figure of Wu Zetian thus became larger than life, a symbol that could carry many different meanings, depending on how the story was told. These tales, repeated across generations, carried her name far beyond the official histories, ensuring that she would not be forgotten. Her tomb, still sealed after more than 1,000 years, has also played a role in her enduring legacy. The unopened chambers of the Tueling Mausoleum have left space for speculation, mystery, and imagination. Some believe that treasures, documents, or even truths about her reign may still lie inside, waiting to be discovered. This uncertainty has added to her lasting presence, as people continue to wonder what might be hidden in the silence of the earth. The fact that her final resting place remains unopened creates a sense of incompleteness, a reminder that her story, even after all this time, is not fully known. In this way, her tomb has become part of her legacy, a quiet monument to her rule and a symbol of the way history can remain partly concealed. Outside of China, Wu Zetian's story has also drawn interest, especially in modern times. For many readers around the world, her reign stands out as a rare example of a woman ruling as emperor in a time and place where male authority was nearly absolute. In this light, she has sometimes been reimagined as a proto-feminist figure, someone who broke barriers and demonstrated the capability of women to lead. This interpretation may not fully match the historical reality, since she did not seek to change the role of women in society broadly, but it shows how her legacy has been adapted to new contexts and new ways of thinking. For modern audiences, her story often resonates as an example of determination, resilience, and the ability to overcome barriers. Her legacy has also endured in the form of debates about morality and politics. Was she a ruthless usurper who disrupted the natural order for her own ambition? Or was she a capable and effective ruler who brought stability to a vast empire? The answer has never been simple, and perhaps it cannot be. The very fact that these questions continue to be asked speaks to the power of her legacy. She is remembered not only for what she did, but also for the questions her life raises about authority, gender, and justice. This ongoing debate has ensured that her name remains alive in classrooms, in scholarship, and in public imagination. Modern media has also contributed to the continued presence of Wu Zetian in cultural memory. Novels, television dramas, films, and artworks have revisited her story, sometimes staying close to history and sometimes reimagining her life with dramatic details. In these portrayals, she often appears as a commanding, intelligent, and formidable figure, one who inspires both awe and caution. These retellings show how her legacy continues to be reshaped, each time reflecting the concerns and values of the present moment. Through such media, her story has reached new audiences, both within China and abroad, expanding the circle of her memory. Her legacy also lies in the institutions and systems she strengthened during her reign. The civil service examinations, which became central to Chinese governance for centuries, gained strong support under her. The emphasis on talent and ability over birth status, while not her invention, was encouraged by her rule and left a long, lasting impact on the structure of government. In this way, her legacy was not only cultural or symbolic, but also practical, embedded in the continuing operation of the state long after her death. Even if her name was sometimes criticized, the systems she helped shape remained part of the backbone of imperial China. In the end, the legacy of Wu Zetian is not one of simplicity or final judgment. It is a legacy of contradiction, of admiration and suspicion, of condemnation and acknowledgement. She remains a figure who cannot be fully praised nor completely dismissed. Her story has outlasted many other rulers who followed her, for while their names may fade, hers continues to be spoken, written, and remembered. The endurance of her legacy reflects not only the unusual nature of her reign, but also the power of history to preserve figures who challenge expectations. The memory of Wu Zetian continues to rest quietly within the broader flow of Chinese history, a steady presence that neither disappears nor fully resolves. She is remembered as a ruler, a symbol, and a mystery. Her legacy lies not only in the events of her reign, but in the way her story has been told and retold, shaped by the voices of different ages, each leaving its mark. And as long as her tomb remains unopened, as long as her story continues to raise questions, her presence will remain part of the unfolding of history. In this way, Wu Zetian's legacy is both a memory and a silence, both a record and a mystery, enduring calmly across the centuries, like the slow passage of time itself. The lessons that can be drawn from the life and reign of Wu Zetian are not delivered in dramatic flourishes or in striking conclusions, but rather in the quiet, measured reflections that emerge when one looks closely at her story and allows it to unfold at its own pace. History often moves slowly with the steady passing of years and the gradual shaping of events, and Wu Zetian's rise and rule offer a chance to think carefully about the patterns of human society, the shifting tides of authority, and the resilience of individuals within systems that are often resistant to change. In her case, the lessons are not just about her as a singular ruler, but also about the broader truths of governance, ambition, gender roles, and the fragile balance between power and morality. One of the most enduring lessons is the way her life highlights the complexity of human ambition. Wu Zetian began her life not as someone destined to rule, but as a child of a relatively well-placed family, educated and given opportunities that many women of her time would not have had. Yet from that beginning, she demonstrated that ambition could be shaped not only by birthright, but by determination, intelligence, and the ability to navigate complicated social and political landscapes. Her ascent from a concubine to the empress consort, then to regent, and eventually to the throne itself as emperor, illustrates that ambition, when coupled with patience and strategy, can alter the expected course of a life. The lesson here is neither one of simple praise nor condemnation, but of recognition. Human beings, regardless of circumstances, often seek to move beyond their given positions. And history is full of examples where such striving reshaped the course of nations. Another lesson that emerges is the way societies both resist and adapt to change. In Wu Zetian's time, the idea of a woman ruling as emperor went against deeply rooted norms. Yet the reality of her reign shows that, when necessity or circumstance demanded, even rigid systems could bend. Her intelligence, decisiveness, and administrative skill allowed her to maintain order and prosperity. And in doing so, she proved that ability could sometimes outweigh prejudice. The lesson is not that societal barriers simply disappear, but that they can be challenged, tested, and, at times, overcome when individuals demonstrate capability in ways that cannot be ignored. This slow process of change is not unique to her story, but is one that recurs across history, reminding us that what seems unchangeable in one era may gradually shift in another. There are also lessons about the exercise of power itself. Zetian was known to use strict measures, including severe punishments and the removal of rivals, to consolidate her rule. These actions have often been judged harshly by later historians, and they raise questions about the balance between necessity and cruelty in leadership. Yet her reign also brought about administrative reforms, the promotion of talented officials, and support for Buddhism, which gave her legitimacy and strengthened her government. The lesson here lies in the dual nature of power. It is rarely exercised in purely benevolent or purely harsh forms, but instead emerges as a blend of both, shaped by circumstances and by the need to maintain authority. Her story illustrates that rulers are often remembered not only for what they achieved, but for the methods they used to secure their place. From a broader perspective, her reign offers lessons about the impermanence of judgment. During her lifetime, Zetian was both respected and feared. After her death, she was condemned by many historians, her reputation clouded by the negative accounts written under the influence of Confucian ideals. Yet as centuries passed, her image shifted, with later writers and modern observers reassessing her achievements and considering the biases of earlier accounts. This process shows that history is not fixed, but constantly reinterpreted. The lesson is that reputations, even of the most powerful, are never fully settled. They are shaped and reshaped by those who tell the story. And each generation may find different meaning in the same life. Her life also suggests lessons about resilience and adaptability. Faced with obstacles, including her position as a woman in a patriarchal society and the rivalries of court politics, she consistently found ways to adjust, to shift alliances, and to use the resources available to her. Instead of retreating in the face of resistance, she adapted to new circumstances and continued moving forward. This kind of resilience is a quiet but powerful reminder of how individuals, even in restrictive systems, can find paths to assert themselves. It is not a story of ease, but of persistence, and the lesson lies in the steady endurance that allows progress to continue, even if slowly. The cultural and symbolic lessons of Zetian's reign also deserve attention. Her support of Buddhism not only strengthened her rule, but also shaped the religious and cultural environment of her time, leaving lasting marks on art, literature, and society. Her willingness to challenge the dominance of Confucian values created space for alternative ideas, even if only temporarily. The lesson here is that rulers, by the choices they make, can influence not only political structures, but also the intellectual and cultural directions of their societies. The ideas they support can echo long after their reigns have ended, shaping the way future generations think and believe. There is also a lesson in the mystery that still surrounds her. The fact that her tomb remains unopened, its contents unknown, serves as a reminder that history often leaves us with incomplete knowledge. No matter how much is recorded, there are always silences, gaps, and unanswered questions. Zetian's sealed resting place symbolizes this truth, reminding us that the past is never fully available to us, and that we must live with uncertainty. The lesson here is one of humility We may seek to understand history, but our understanding will always be partial, shaped by what survives and what is lost. Ultimately, the lessons of Wu Zetian's life and reign are neither simple nor straightforward. They do not present themselves in bold statements, but in quiet reflections, in the recognition of complexity, and in the awareness that human lives, especially those lived in power, are filled with contradictions. Her story teaches about ambition and resilience, about the potential for change within rigid systems, about the dual nature of power, and about the shifting judgments of history. It also teaches about patience, endurance, and the quiet force of determination that can carry a person further than expected. These lessons, when considered slowly and carefully, are not dramatic or unsettling, but calm and steady. Like the slow unfolding of time itself, they remind us that history is not only about battles and grand events, but also about the quiet persistence of individuals who, through their choices, reshape the world around them. Wu Zetian's life, when viewed in this way, becomes not just the story of a single ruler, but a meditation on the patterns of human history, on the interplay of ambition and restraint, and on the lasting questions of how we judge those who came before us. The story of Wu Zetian does not end with her achievements, her reforms, or even her controversies, but rather with the quiet inevitability of time and the way all lives, no matter how extraordinary, must eventually come to a close. By the time she reached the later years of her life, she had already accomplished something that no other woman in Chinese history had done. She had ruled as emperor, not merely as empress consort or regent, but as the singular ruler of the realm. Yet, as the years passed, her health began to decline, her strength diminished, and the very court she had controlled with such precision began to slowly slip beyond her grasp. It was not dramatic or sudden, but gradual, like the slow fading of a candle's light. This quiet decline marked the closing of her chapter, reminding us that even the most powerful must yield to the passage of time. Her final years were shaped by illness, by the loss of energy that had once allowed her to command vast bureaucracies and armies with ease. The woman who had risen from concubine to emperor was now confined by the limitations of her body. In these years, the officials who had once bowed before her began to consider the future of the dynasty, weighing how the empire would transition once she was gone. They knew that her reign had been remarkable, but they also knew that continuity mattered, that the Tang dynasty must be restored to stability after her unprecedented rule. This quiet maneuvering took place around her as she weakened. And while she remained the emperor in name, the reality of power was already beginning to shift. It was a reminder that leadership, however commanding, is always temporary, tied as it is to the fragile human form. Eventually, she was persuaded, or perhaps compelled, to abdicate in favor of restoring the Tang dynasty. After decades of holding the highest authority, she stepped down, retreating into the seclusion of her private quarters. This act, though it could be seen as a loss, was in its own way a fitting conclusion, for it allowed her reign to come to an end without the chaos of violent overthrow or rebellion. Her departure was quiet, measured, and orderly, just as much of her governance had been. In this transition, we see the calm acceptance of history's rhythm, the rise, the rule, and the fall, all parts of the same cycle that has repeated countless times across empires and centuries. Her death in the year 705 was not met with spectacle, but with solemnity. She was laid to rest in a grand tomb at Qianling, the resting place she shared with her husband, Emperor Gaozong. This tomb was constructed to reflect her stature, and yet what makes it most striking is its silence. Unlike many imperial tombs, filled with inscriptions boasting of the ruler's accomplishments, Wu Zetian's tombstone remains blank, with no words carved into it. The absence of an inscription leaves her story open, unsealed, and subject to interpretation. This silence has become one of the most powerful aspects of her legacy, for it allows future generations to project their own understanding of her reign, to reconsider her not only as she was portrayed in official histories, but as she might have truly been. The blank stone is both an ending and a continuation, a quiet conclusion that invites reflection. The calm conclusion of her story lies not in grand proclamations, but in the simple fact that her reign came to an end. Her life reached its natural close, and she returned to the earth like all who came before and after her. Yet in that return, her memory remained, echoing across centuries. Later historians debated her character, often criticizing her harsh methods or her ambition, while others reassessed her as a capable ruler who challenged traditions and left a lasting mark. In these shifting judgments, her story demonstrates that no conclusion is ever final. That memory continues to evolve. But in her time, the conclusion was quiet, without rebellion or spectacle. A peaceful return to obscurity after decades of prominence. Her story reminds us that the end of life, even for the most powerful, is not marked by noise, but by stillness. The bustling court that once trembled at her commands eventually moved on to new rulers. The officials who had sought her approval began serving others. The empire she had ruled continued, its great walls and palaces enduring long after her passing. Her body rested beneath the earth, while above it the seasons changed, the rains fell, and the winds moved across the plains. In this way, her conclusion was like all others, a blending back into the quiet rhythm of nature, where the ambitions and struggles of life dissolve into the steady turning of time. The calmness of her ending also carries a kind of reassurance. It tells us that even those who lived remarkable, turbulent lives are ultimately brought to the same stillness. The controversies fade, the rivalries end, and what remains is memory, reshaped by each telling. For Wu Zetian, the calm conclusion of her story allows us to look back not with agitation, but with reflection, to consider her life as part of the great flow of history. Her reign may have challenged norms, her methods may have been harsh, and her ambitions may have been great, but her ending was like the soft closing of a book, a quiet reminder that all stories must eventually be set aside. As centuries passed, the people of China continued to live under dynasties that rose and fell, under rulers who commanded and then faded into the past. Wu Zetian became part of that long chain of memory, neither erased nor entirely celebrated, but present in the collective story of a civilization. Her blank tombstone remains, a symbol of that calm conclusion, inviting each new age to decide for itself what lesson to take from her life. And perhaps the truest lesson is simply that her story, like all stories, has an end that is not final but open, a gentle reminder that history is never entirely complete. Thus, the conclusion of Wu Zetian's life is not one of drama or spectacle, but one of stillness and calm. Her reign, so remarkable in its defiance of norms, gave way to silence, and in that silence she found her final place. The world continued on, the empire endured, and she became part of the vast expanse of history, resting quietly beneath the earth while her memory lingered. It is a fitting end for a story, told not with excitement or agitation, but with the steady, monotonous rhythm of history itself. A conclusion as calm as sleep, as quiet as the night, as unremarkable and inevitable as the passing of time.